Hi, I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to part two of this special 50 Faces podcast, where we are focusing on brain function, attention span, what's happening to that when it comes to the current generation, and how we can possibly reverse the slide. In part one of the podcast, we exposed the problem. I was joined there, as I am now, by Carolina Pacheco-Punceles, and we spoke about, in that podcast, some of the challenges that the current generation are facing in terms of their attention span. And let's hear a little bit of what we discussed there.
We're not challenging our brains enough. We're not putting them in thinking labs. We are more just kind of presenting information to people in a silver platter instead of involving them in the thinking process. Are we really just involving them, getting that hands-on creativity? Give me an idea. How would you solve it? How would you have solved that problem if you were back in the 5th century of the world? What would you have done back in the Renaissance? And then you start thinking and bringing curiosity. Oh, how can I bring that learning from the past and connect it to today? And then we start collecting. That's the beauty of math and data.
Welcome back, Carolina. Great to see you again.
Thank you so much for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here with you and talk about such an important topic.
Well, as we mentioned, part two is supposed to be about the techniques we can use to address this problem. But even in the short time frame between which we're recording these two podcasts, more news has emerged about the effect of the use of AI. We did touch upon that in the podcast. In particular, there was an article from MIT which suggested that it compared the essays and the neural function of a group of students who had had LLM-assisted essay writing versus non-LLM-assisted essay writing. And essentially, the gist of that article was the significant differences in brain connectivity that were shown in the brain-only participants, which had stronger, more distributed networks, versus the LLM users, which had weak connectivity. So this is, in a way, a first sign that there's an actual damage or impact on our brain function. Equally, even when it comes to ownership of the content, there was a suggestion that the LLM only users felt less ownership of the content, less recall relating to the content, and generally were less connected with what they had written, where with brain only group, perhaps due to more visceral connection with producing this content, there was a higher ownership of that. So that's just the snapshot that I'm giving there based on that article. But you and Niall Ferguson and many other commentators have picked up on this article with some conclusions. So can you maybe give us a summary of some of your initial thoughts when you heard about this article?
The initial prompts, it was just like there was a lot of panic and fear. It was basically a lot of people were saying that we were doomed and we had no moving forward, that now AI was taking over our brain power. Now, I like to think about it differently. I like to think it's just a call for awareness and something that we need to start teaching much more than we were teaching before. The need for problem solving and how do we actually get to bring that adaptive learning into our everyday thinking, because AI is not just a tool anymore. It's also an agent that is coming in to work along us, as you mentioned before. It's a co-pilot to be working alongside with us, whether we like it or not. So yeah, I think of that article is more basically, there's a cognitive cost if we just rely so much on LLM, but at the same time, there is a value to it because then we can delegate certain things that we don't really necessarily need so much mental power. That's my thought into it.
And I think that is certainly the essence of the very positive effect of AI, how it maybe facilitates research, facilitates criticism of that research and a critical voice. And it can actually really be your devil's advocate, maybe, if you're developing, say, an argument or a piece of writing. However, I suggest, as I will now, that using it the correct way requires quite an intentional intent on our part and almost a training required to do that. So as I mentioned, the purpose of this part of the podcast was to look at what we can do to address the slide. And I suppose if we were to think about categorizing ways that we could address the slide of attention span, brain function, cognitive ability, clearly we have two categories. We have the categories of general health and what we might do in that domain. And then we have training tools or techniques that we can employ, that we can read about and bring into our curricula and into our classrooms and into our even our daily lives in order to actively ensure that we develop this muscle, this cognitive muscle that may have been maybe declining, how we actually optimize that. So first of all, in the category of health, if we look online or if we look at just general ways to improve attention span, some of these are as old as time. We talk about prioritizing sleep, getting more exercise, improving your nutrition. There's a lot of brain food out there, salmon, cod liver oil, designed to optimize brain function. We hear about diets, and increasingly we hear more about mindfulness, and whether that's meditation or just simply a mindful approach to work and to leadership, to active listening. So these are just a few of the categories that I come up with when I look at the general kind of health backdrop that we could look to improve our brain function. What are your thoughts on some of those methods and anything that you've seen that works particularly well?
So in regards to the health, let me just start with, I sign all my emails by wishing every receiver of my emails, wishing you health, well-being, and joy. And there is a reason for that, because truly that's the reason why I do my work and why I like to work with humans to flourish. So anything that we can do for us humans to flourish, which is that has been the search for humanity ever since humanity has existed, I like to bring into that. It's not only the mindfulness into sitting down to meditate, is it mindfulness and while you're sitting down to eat and while you're eating something? It's a mindfulness and the intention of where you are, like us recording this podcast. Are we here listening and intending in to be connected with? So it's intention, it's connection, it's also what's the meaning behind what we're doing. Because I see a lot of people as well exercising and they have this to-do list of exercise. And I don't know if you go to a gym or not, but when I go to any type of gym or public class, I see a lot of people just going to do this checklist of exercises, but their intention, when you go and connect with them, their intention is like they're really not there. So we could be doing all of the right things, but if we don't have that connection of what the intention is behind of what we're doing, whether we're exercising our mental gym, our brain, or our body, then really we just lose the intentionality of what we're trying to do. And then we lose human agency right there, because then we're just doing it because it needs to be done and not because it's actually going to bring us that human flourishing that we need to bring. And that's going to separate us from that AI agent that is able and capable to create things and do things and think for us as well, if we allow it.
And I think, just as we go to the regular gym, you schedule time to go there, you fit it into your schedule and you make time for the exercise. The mental gym too, I think it benefits from having time allocated to it. And many people have started doing this with morning puzzles, with Wordle. Some people are taking up Mahjong. They play bridge. This has been happening for decades, an active attempt to stay active, usually in retirement or older age. These skills, they generally have not, until recently, I think, filtered down to the younger generations. Generally, it was assumed that either school, education, or work would be the place where your mind was exercised. You didn't need to artificially train it. I think that's changing now. There seems to be a sense that this word puzzles or just daily brain exercise is a good thing. Another way of going to the mental gym is doing something like in my workplace, it would be, say, presenting macro write-ups or writing a blog or writing a newsletter. That regularity of that on a weekly basis forces you to gather your thoughts, to sort those thoughts out and really put them into sort of digestible form. And then doing that on a weekly basis as a routine, as a discipline, that then enables you to really generate those thoughts more effectively and spout perhaps in an interview setting or orally. So that's another example, I think, of that mental gym that we're speaking about. How about then this idea that is very clear in medicine of see one, do one, teach one? So there's a sense that you really don't master a topic until you teach it. And this is something that I'm thinking maybe could be integrated into the workplace. Having senior people or more mid-level people teach junior people instead of outsourcing it to an education service or a CPE, having that done in the workplace to ensure that mastery is achieved.
So within that, the teaching part, that's when mastery, I 100% agree with that. But it's also come the essential need even for the master to get into that uncomfortable position of teaching, because it's not the same as just telling somebody. So when we're doing that, let's say the mentor comes in and teaches the younger generation about what they need to learn right away, that's a mental gym for the mentor. Because let's remember, our brain will choose the lines of the least resistance. So anything that if we're repeating, and like, for example, let's take your blog that you write, and after so many, I don't know, after 100 blogs, perhaps it's not really challenging you that much. But now if you start interviewing different people like myself and all the other people, then we're all teaching you something, because then we're all unexpectedly going to answer you in a different way. And that right away, it's creating a mental gym for you. So those mental gyms don't have to be as grandiose as some people like to think. They can just be as, like you said, teaching somebody else. And it's just everybody learns differently, no matter what. So then that way, basically, not only the younger generation or the new person is coming in learning, also the mentor is learning, because there is a constant adjustment of processes to connect.
Absolutely. And I think then, getting into other ways of just generally ensuring that that brain function is optimized is getting outside the comfort zone. We mentioned learning new skills, learning a language, pursuing excellence in sport, not just the kind of mental sports, but just any sport, anything that is complex involving strategy. Those are all good techniques, I suppose, to take into account. I suppose some of this, though, presumes maybe that we have a certain level of function that we want to maintain. And we want to ensure that that function is continuously, it just is enhanced and stretched. How about, I think, when we are those formative years in education, for example, that may be stolen now from new generations because of AI and other props and tools that were not there. In a way, that's where I think some of this sense of urgency has been created. And I just wanted to quote from Niall Ferguson, who did come up with a set of suggestions in reaction to the MIT article I mentioned. He speaks about, in a place of learning like university, creating a cloister, which is artificially ring-fenced from the rest of the world in the sense of access to devices, access to LM. He speaks about inside the cloister allocating time to reading printed books, discussion, the old-fashioned debate, writing essays and problem sets with old-fashioned pen and paper, assessing exams being written, being oral, not having access to these tools. And that this time in the cloister would be, say, 7 hours a day. And then they could leave the cloister at the end of the 7 hours, as well as on vacations, use AI then. And the idea being that this kind of a disciplined approach that is quite intentional, quite artificial, is a way to kind of develop that skill set. Maybe this is a little extreme, but what do you think of some of the ideas behind this proposal?
To me, I'm a little bit of a devil's advocate in that sense. I go back to Adam Smith teaching of natural liberty. And again, I'm huge about that, the essential need, especially for the younger generations, to have that human agency. I think part of what we have lost over the past, 30, 40 years within the working industry is that human agency. We have follow up on copying and paste. And then now we have huge innovation coming in. And then basically, to me, that almost sounds like, oh, let's just throw your phone on the sea and let's just come back 7 hours later and pick it up. And then when you pick it up, then we know, as we spoke in the previous podcast, there's been enough research, and we're not going to go into that, I don't think, today. But if we allow so much attention towards the screen or giving so much intention into the screen, then basically there increases the level of anxiety across all ages, not just the younger generation. So if the key is to teach our younger generations to have that attention muscle, then we need to actually create more of like, okay, right now for an hour, you're going to put your phone over there on the counter or on my desk as the teacher or whatever the setting is. And I do it every day. As I'm working and I'm writing, and I write on a piece of paper before I publish something, because I'm exercising, I'm doing my own mental gym, Then basically I put the phone aside, don't look at it. And then I come back and then I look at it. Yes, I might get a notification and I might get the urgent need to go and look at it. But if we start doing that more and more, then we are increasing that intentionality in the students to say, you have the power. To me, it's much more is teaching the younger generations that they have the power and they can have the muscle to say no to the devices and to the notifications and to algorithms trying to teach us and to not so much teach us, but to tell us what to read and what not to absorb as well. So then if we put it in a cluster, then what are you going to do for the next hours of the day? Are you just going to be attached to it and then more than 4 hours? It's clinically proven that you're going to be in a panic state. So I'm a little bit of a devil's advocate in that sense, because we are to rebuild focus. And it's not just the younger generations, it's also our generation that needs to do that as well.
It's interesting that, because I think if there was a school that was to adopt this cloister model, say a secondary school, a high school, I think they would be very much in demand. I think there is enough concern about the lack of limits in terms of use of LLMs and AI that a school that was committed to, not 24 hours a day, but to a part of the day, and that everyone bought in, I think there would be a desire for it, even if it is, you mentioned, is a little extreme. It's an interesting thought. And I think the key thing is this connections. We need to not have a situation where connections are eroding or where brain function is suboptimal because of relying on tools, which, will just be a kind of a slippery slope in terms of the progress. And, AI itself, when asked, can come up with ways to avert over-reliance. And it comes down to things. It's interesting. I've heard people often use AI to do a first draft and then they put their own gloss on that. Some suggestions are that you should do the first draft, let AI then develop counter arguments, enrich, deepen some of the arguments. I've also heard about AI, better to use it to generate bullet points, not to generate full pieces of prose, because that's usually the kind of prose that becomes very repetitive with certain words and kind of obviously distinguishable as AI, whereas bullet points you can at least embellish with your own language. And then I think there's also suggestion around just balance, having days off or using the bot like a coach and not a writer. So lots of kind of practical suggestions there. And then there's a whole set of, which we can talk about in a minute, ways to actually train your brain to approach an exam and to memorize material. I mean, some of those things around AI, it seems like you would support that kind of balanced approach, that not over-reliance, but some real on-again, off-again type approach.
To me, learning is about, we need to have certain amount of friction. And that MIT article that you quoted at the beginning of the podcast basically was teaching us that, in my opinion. He was teaching us like, hey, you cannot just rely on LLM because you're not going to remember your work. You're not going to really learn as much as you think. So where's the friction? The friction are we just telling AI, write a letter to so-and-so, or are you putting your points in that you want to go and an argument into that? And then it's about reclaiming that control that we have, the ability to think and to learn new things. So we can just start writing an article, and I share my process. I write it on a piece of pen and paper. I put in bullet points, and then I start creating, or sometimes I even send myself a WhatsApp audio message because I thought of something, or I dream of something in the middle of the night and I write it down, and then the next day I just expand on it. So after that, I start writing on it, and then why not use AI to say, okay, what am I missing here? And then you start having a thinking partner, or not a creative partner that might say, oh, you're going off topic here. Okay, well, why am I going off topic? I'm seeing it that we need, for example, as I wrote on LinkedIn about the MIT process, I was seeing a lot of fear, but AI could not think or see the fear that I was reading from so many posts that were being published. So that's what I was trying to transmit on my LinkedIn post about the MIT article, for example. So then when we start adding friction, we start learning. friction within our brain. And that's the agency that I'm referring to. And that's why more of a balance is more like, okay, are you really creating that friction within the younger generations to teach them you're going to feel uncomfortable because you don't have the tool, and you are going to feel that you need to come up with ideas yourself. And let's face it, we're not all creative at all times. It depends also what you were saying before, that need for health, for sleeping, for eating well, for exercising, and all of the important things that we need to be creative. So it's kind of like a whole package together.
That's so interesting. And I'm just to conclude, I do think that some of the techniques that we're seeing, a lot of it gets to things I learned at college, how to prepare for exams, recall, reducing things into smaller and smaller bite-sized information with just a set of keywords, with like having a mnemonic perhaps for remembering, the 6 points of a law case, in my case, because I studied law. That's how, you learn that the planets of the solar system. It's how you learn how to read music, is, memorizing rhymes that teach you. And then that opens up the whole kind of span of learning behind that. So I do think that actually having exam technique, recall technique, mastery technique is important. We already have in high schools executive function classes, I think, and maybe expanding that into that. And I would suggest that that's probably an extension of mindfulness technique, because, if our brains are losing some function, then the need to be mindful about that is less important than the need to actually regain some of that function. So I'd suggest we could even meld some of the mindfulness training with some of the mind training that I'm referring to here. And it's great that you've cited the Daniel Kahneman friction concept, because I know they illustrate that with many examples in terms of, reading something in small font will kind of focus the mind and get you to actually pay more attention to that. And when there is a little bit of a barrier to entry or friction, it tends to, even though it's annoying, it tends to actually wake you up and get you to pay attention. So just think, any concluding thoughts in terms of, one thing or two things that you think a listener could take away from this podcast to implement in their own lives to just be more aware of how to keep the function?
Make a point of really like having that friction, I will say. Make a point of reflection throughout the week and figuring out, what did I learn new today? What did I unlearn today? To me, that's essential, because that actually expands our curiosity and our need for creative problem solving, which is our critical thinking that we more and more need today. So it's like, be your own mental gym. Question yourself, am I creating enough friction within my own muscles, meaning your brain? Because we are human agent, and we can be shapers of our own agency, and that's on us. And let's teach that to our kids too. That's more important. Let's teach that to our next generations.
Fantastic, Carolina. Well, I think that has given us literally food for thought. I appreciate you coming here and for helping us think about the problem, and more importantly, look beyond the problem to active ways that we can address that. I've been looking forward to doing this podcast for some time. I feel very charged up now with tons of ideas, and look forward to putting some of them into action in my lives and in the lives of others. Thank you again for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to this special 50 Faces two-part series. And you can find all of our content on the 50 Faces Hub, where you will find resources, role models, and other techniques to enhance your career. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.